Welcome to Dismantling the Narrative with CMB 613. Please like and subscribe if you agree with what I'm saying here. If you disagree, or if I said something wrong, please let me know in the comments. Thank you. Now, let's get into it. You know how it is, right? You often feel like you have a handle on a public figure, on their personality, long before you could name a single one of their policies. Today, we're going to dissect exactly how that happens, how media coverage creates a narrative that can totally define a person in the public eye.
And yeah, that brings us to the biggest question of this whole explainer. When you're looking at a leader, what's really guiding your opinion? Is it their actual plans and policies, or is it the character that the media has built up around them? So here's our game plan for today. We're going to start with what a media frame is and why it's so powerful. Then we'll dive into a case study of two totally different narratives. After that, we'll peel back the layers on style versus substance, see how these stories actually move the needle on votes, and finally, wrap up with what all this means for you. All right, let's jump right into our first section, the power of the frame. Before you can spot it in the wild, you gotta know what a media frame actually is. And trust me, it's a key concept if you want to understand the news today. A media frame isn't about telling lies or making stuff up. Not at all. It's all about selection and emphasis. It's the choice of what to put in the spotlight and what to leave in the shadows. This is so powerful because it doesn't just shape what you think, it shapes how you think about pretty much anything.
Okay, so let's see this thing in action. We're going to look at a specific case study from the source material, and this is where all that theory starts to feel very, very real.
And boom, this lays out the contrast perfectly. The sources point out that one figure, Poilievre, often gets framed with words like combative and polarizing. Right away, that creates a narrative of conflict, of being a disruptor. Then you look at the other side, a hypothetical frame for someone like Carney, and the words are competent, calm, safe. That's a narrative of stability. Now, notice what's missing. Any mention of actual policy. It's all about style. And that's the whole point, right? We have to ask, what gets left on the cutting room floor when the entire focus is on personality and style? What's the real substance hiding behind the story?
Well, according to the source material, behind that combative frame, there's a pretty clear right-wing populist agenda. We're talking about very specific, concrete goals: aggressive tax cuts, a hard line on immigration, shrinking the government. These are massive ideas that often get completely lost in the conversation about a candidate's tone of voice.
Now, this is where it gets really fascinating. This quote totally reframes a personality trait. So the media might see a direct, maybe even confrontational style and label it rude. But this analysis offers a different take. What if that bluntness isn't rudeness at all? What if it actually comes from a place of deep passion and genuine care about getting straight answers?
And this brings us to a really important idea from the sources, the decorum trap. Basically, it's this weird quirk in our media culture that can reward politicians who are super smooth and polite, even while they're dodging every question. We call that professional. But at the same time, it punishes the ones who are blunt and honest, framing them as aggressive, just for being direct.
This table just lays it out perfectly. A blunt, confrontational style. The common frame is aggressive, but you could just as easily interpret it as passionate or engaged. On the flip side, a calm, polite style is usually framed as professional, but couldn't that also be seen as detached or maybe even indifferent? It all comes down to the frame. Okay, so this isn't just some abstract media theory. The analysis is clear. These frames have a huge decisive impact on how people actually vote. This is where the rubber meets the road.
And the sources really zero in on this. Look, if you're a diehard partisan, you've probably already made up your mind. But for all those undecided, moderate voters in the middle, they are the ones who are most swayed by these narratives. A simple story of competence versus a story of chaos can absolutely be the thing that tips the scales for them.
This chart just shows you the potential power of this in a really stark way. Imagine a candidate gets hit with a combative frame. Maybe they poll at 35% with moderates. Now, take that exact same candidate with the exact same policies, but give them a competent frame. Suddenly, their support could rocket up to 65%. That is a wild swing, and it's based entirely on perception.
So, here it is, the bottom line. The story, the narrative that gets told about a candidate can actually become more influential than their platform. How they're perceived can end up mattering way more than the substance of their ideas.
So, now that you know all this, what do you do about it? How can you become a smarter news consumer and see past these media frames? Well, here are 4 practical steps. First, when you're watching the news, actively try to identify the frame. Ask yourself, what's the story they're selling here? Second, make a real effort to separate the style from the substance. Hunt for the actual policy details. Third, question the adjectives. When you see words like combative or calm, ask if they're really justified. And finally, always look for the nuance. Remember, there's almost always another way to interpret someone's behavior.
We'll just leave you with this final thought to chew on. Media narratives essentially paint a portrait of a person. The real question is, are you seeing the actual person with all their complicated ideas and flaws, or are you just seeing the artist's finished portrait? Something to think about. Thanks again for watching. I appreciate you very much. Please share with your friends. Keep it tight.
All right, let's get right into it. Today we're tackling something pretty huge, the crisis of trust in Canadian media. You can feel it, right? It's this perfect storm of financial problems, government money, and a whole lot of public skepticism.
You know, this quote really just hits the nail on the head. It perfectly captures that feeling so many Canadians have right now. It's like there's a growing gap between the news we're getting and the world we're actually living in. So just how big is that gap?
Well, here's the number that tells the story. According to a major study from the Reuters Institute, only 40% of Canadians say they trust the mainstream media. That is a 10-year low. A number that low isn't just a dip, it's a sign of a real breakdown. And it makes you wonder, how on earth did we get here?
To figure out how we ended up at that 40% number, we first have to look at how the entire landscape has changed. Over the last decade, it's not just the news that's different, it's how we find it, how we read it, everything.
I mean, just look at this. 10 years ago, a good chunk of us, over 40%, were reading a physical newspaper every day. Fast forward to today, that's dropped to less than 1 in 5. And at the same time, almost all of us, nearly 9 out of 10, get our news online now. This wasn't just a small shift, it was a total earthquake. And it completely shattered the business model that kept journalism running for over a century.
So that massive migration online, it triggered the first wave of this crisis, the financial squeeze. The way news organizations made money for generations just stopped working.
For the longest time, news was paid for by ads and subscriptions. Simple enough. But online, that whole system just crumbled. Big tech companies swallowed up the digital ad market, and print ad money basically evaporated. And the result? It's been brutal. Huge, devastating layoffs. We're talking 1,300 jobs gone at Bell Media, Post Media cutting 11% of its writers and editors. This collapse left a huge void, and with newsrooms shrinking, the federal government felt it had to do something.
So, with the industry pretty much on life support, the federal government stepped in with a massive financial aid package. The goal was to save journalism, but this solution might have created an even trickier problem.
And their answer was to open up the checkbook. We're talking about a massive lifeline, almost $600 million. Back in 2018, this government package rolled out things like tax credits and direct funding for salaries, all to try and keep Canadian newsrooms from going dark.
And right there, that's the core of the dilemma. When the government becomes one of the main funders for the press, can that press ever be truly independent? I mean, can you really hold the people who sign your paychecks accountable? For most Canadians, the answer to that is a pretty firm no.
And if you look at the polling, it's not even close. A big majority of Canadians, 59%, are actually against the government funding private news outlets. And the number one reason they give, they feel it gets in the way of journalistic independence. Only about 19% are actually for it.
And if you dig a little deeper, the skepticism gets even stronger. A poll from The Hub found that more than 3 out of every 4 Canadians believe that this government money makes it harder for the media to do its most important job, holding the government accountable. It's not just a small concern, it's a widespread feeling that the money itself creates a huge conflict of interest.
And here's how that perception plays out in the real world. The argument from sources is that this funding creates 2 different standards for news coverage. On one hand, you have the governing party, the ones providing the funds, and the perception is that the coverage of them is often softer. On the other hand, coverage of opposition leaders like Pierre Poilievre is seen as way more critical, almost relentlessly so. The fear is simple, right? You don't bite the hand that feeds you, but you're free to go after their opponents.
But hey, government influence? That's only one piece of the puzzle. The next layer in this whole crisis of trust is about who actually owns the media in Canada.
Researchers have been saying this for years. Canada has one of the most concentrated media markets in the entire developed world. A very small number of massive corporations, we're talking Post Media, Bell, Rogers, They control almost everything we read, watch, and hear. And when there's so little competition, you get fewer independent voices, and just a few corporate points of view tend to dominate everything. Now, this kind of concentration can lead to some really sneaky but powerful types of bias. One of the biggest is bias by selection. This is where you can shape public opinion without telling a single lie. It's all about which stories you choose to put on the front page and which ones you decide to just ignore. As the example here shows, two news outlets can report 100% factual stories about the same policy, but give you two completely different versions of reality just by picking and choosing what to focus on.
And then you've got its close cousin, bias by omission. This isn't about which stories you pick, it's about the details you decide to leave out of a story. By dropping a key piece of context, or maybe a politically awkward fact, a report can paint a very incomplete picture, but present it as the whole truth. It shapes your opinion without you even realizing what you're missing.
So, let's recap. We have a struggling industry, it's propped up by government money that people don't trust, and it's owned by just a handful of giant corporations. So, what happens next? Well, the public starts looking for the exit. They start looking for alternatives.
And this is where they're going. The polling shows this huge contrast. While trust in mainstream media is stuck down at 40%, it jumps all the way to 60% for outlets that are funded directly by their audience. The message here is pretty clear. People trust outlets that are accountable to them, not to a government department or a corporate board.
And this trend is even more powerful with younger Canadians. For anyone under 35, YouTube isn't just one of the options, it is now the #1 place they go for news. That one stat tells you everything. People aren't giving up on news, they're giving up on the old institutions they don't feel they can trust anymore.
And the process that got us here is actually pretty simple when you break it down. First, distrust in the old media grows, and people start questioning their motives. Then, platforms like YouTube come along and break the grip of the traditional gatekeepers, letting anyone share their own take. And finally, the audience moves, looking for creators and voices that feel more transparent, more authentic. And really, this quote from the source material just sums the whole thing up. At the end of the day, there's this feeling that institutions, whether it's the government, corporations, or the media itself, are more interested in controlling the story than they are in telling the truth.
So all of this leaves us with a really big question. As all these old media structures start to crumble, the responsibility sort of shifts to us. In an age with so much information and so much distrust, who do you choose to believe? Who becomes your source of truth? And why? That's the real question we all have to answer now. Thanks for joining me for this explainer.